Hello, YNABers. My name is Jesse Meekum for YNAB, where we teach you 4 rules to help you stop living paycheck to paycheck, get out of debt, and save more money. Today, I am pleased to have joined with me Kristy and Bryce. They are the authors, married couple, authors of Quit Like a Millionaire. I have read a lot of personal finance books, so many, and I could not put this book down. I would read a little blurb to Julie and then read another little blurb to her, and then 10 minutes later I was just reading the whole thing to her. Kristy has a fascinating upbringing, coming from a very, very poor 40 cents a day type of existence in China, emigrating to Canada, and retiring as a millionaire by the age of 30 with her husband Bryce. They did it all with very normal incomes, but the contrast and the embracing of scarcity that you see throughout the book just had me grinning from ear to ear. Not because it was pleasant for Kristy, but because it was so instructive. So we dive into all sorts of things, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Here we go. All right, Kristy and Bryce, authors of Quit Like a Millionaire, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us, Jesse.
Super excited.
Yeah. So we know each other offline as well because we hung out in Ecuador for a week, right?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. You were there.
How long?
When Mustache was there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, what was it? Not 2.5 years ago, maybe? Gosh, it probably was.
Yeah, I think it was around 2 years ago.
Maybe. Yeah, 2 years ago. That was.
And was this book, this book was probably in the works from the time you guys started your blog. And the blog is millennialrevolution.com. Did I get that one right?
Yeah, yep, millennialrevolution.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Millennialrevolution.com. So tell me a little bit, at our time in Ecuador 2.5 years ago, where was the book at that point? I'm just personally curious.
That's when the book was created almost.
That was actually a really interesting time because basically a week before we started chatting in Chautauqua, I actually got an email from a editor at Penguin. And at first I thought it was just spam. I'm like, come on, as if I'm really talking to editor. But then when I actually opened it up, she's like, hey, I'm a fan of your blog, and I found out about it because my client, who is actually a Hollywood actress, referred me to you, and I was wondering if you want to write a book. So, it's just an email drops out of the sky from an editor. And so actually, initially I was kind of hesitant because I was like, do I really want to write a book? Like I don't know how interesting my story is. It actually took some prodding from the editor because she found out about my story, which is the fact that at one point in China, I lived in abject poverty with my family, and we were living on 44 cents a day. And then going from there all the way to my journey, which is retiring at the age of 31 as a millionaire and traveling the world, she found that was really interesting. So she's like, maybe if you write this story, this will actually help a lot of people who are struggling. And then you can tell the lessons that you learned from poverty going into where you are now, and do like a step-to-step guide on that. So so when we were there, I was not even sure that I should write the book. It was just, I was just telling you, hey, an editor reached out to me about this book. No, I don't know if that's exactly that, right?
Yeah. What's interesting, what I loved about your book is, the first part is I've read a lot of personal finance books. So when you get into like, you guys don't do anything new, terribly new, although I like how you explained some of the kind of headier concepts around investing in things, but that's much later in the book. And you start to find that the book aligns very well with exactly what I would tell someone, exactly what many well-meaning people that don't earn commissions from giving advice would say, right? Mm-hmm. And so I love that, obviously, but the first part where your story is where I was really hooked. So maybe dive in a little bit on, 44 cents a day speaks volumes. I read aloud to Julie, who you know, like we were sitting there in bed and I'm reading your book and I'm like, oh, listen to this. And then like 2 minutes later, I'm like, Julie, listen to this. And then I'm like, okay, just keep listening. I'm just going to keep going. And I was all about your dad and what he had experienced. I mean, he lived, if you were living in, correct me if I'm misspeaking, but if you were living in just abject poverty, I don't even know if I have words to describe what your dad survived, right?
Oh, yeah. My dad always told me you're very lucky and you basically grew up in just a bubble because what he went through was so much worse. And I think my dad gave me really good perspective because he was basically in a labor camp for 10 years. Because this happened during the Cultural Revolution, where, if you were born to the wrong parents and your parents happened to work for the opposition, after the Civil War, you are basically being sent off to the countryside to do hard labor for 10 years. And there's no hope for your future, right? Just because of how you were born, you have no choice. So my dad always taught me that, no matter how bad things seem, they can always, always, always be so much worse.
Mm-hmm. And normally we flip that. We're like, oh, it'll get better. It could be better. It'll get better. But there's some instruction there around saying, oh, no, it could be worse. So let's find the good here.
For him, it was like, for him, it's kind of like, if you come to him with a problem, he would just kind of go like, okay, if the communists aren't breaking down your door, that's not a real problem. Yeah. Which is an interesting way to look at life, I suppose. Is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? I'm not sure what it is.
It just is, Yeah. And you take instruction from it. So Kristy, when did you guys, I can't remember what age you were when you ended up in Canada. Was it 8, 7?
Yeah, 8.
Okay.
Yep.
8 years old.
Yeah. So when I first came to Canada, I was amazed by everything. So, that show like Breaking Amish, where, people are amazed by the light switches and electricity. Yeah, that was me. I was like, whoa, it's a toilet. Like, how does this thing work? How does one use a toilet? And just hot water was amazing. A can of Coke made me so excited. I had a massive nosebleed because I never drank anything that delicious in my life. So it really is this perspective that my dad gave me, and the perspective of actually growing up in another country at the point where in the 80s, where the poverty rate in China was 84%. So going from that, now China has really modernized, but back then it was because the Cultural Revolution that my dad had gone through and all the just struggles that people have gone through made me realize that, coming to Canada and anytime that you run into a problem, like back at that point, we still had to send money back home. We still had to support the family.
Definitely. Yeah.
So the idea that I have to wear thrift store clothes or, I'm being bullied at school, that was really, it was a struggle, but it was really not a big deal in the, when you look at the context of it and when you look at, when you have that perspective. So my dad always taught me that, so there's a Chinese saying we have, which is called 吃苦, which means literally eat bitterness. Right. So he's always saying you need to 吃苦, this is good for you. It's for building character. And if you don't have any struggles in life, you don't have any obstacles or constraints, then you're not going to build any character. You're just going to be super soft and you're never going to realize what it's like in the real world. So in the book, there's actually a chapter in which I describe my dad teaching me some very, very harsh lessons about life and about education. And I never really resented him for it because I could really see his point of view.
Yeah.
So I think that this is one of the things that I think helped basically us get here, which is become financially independent at the age of 31. And now we're actually traveling the world. It made me realize that the kind of obstacles that other people would have considered insurmountable, maybe going through poverty or going through engineering, which was very difficult for me because I wanted to be a writer and I gave up my dream. It was really not a big deal for me because I realized that we all live in a society that is very privileged. There's research done that if you earn just $34,000 a year in the States, you are the top 1% of the world, right?
Yeah.
So it really is helps you see the big picture and beyond kind of the bubble that we live in.
Yeah, that's fun. That perspective shift is, you were born into it. I can't say I would wish it on people in order to have those lessons, but then I can't also deny how formative those lessons were for you in just where you landed, right? And so there was this interesting trajectory early on. Tell me a little bit about, because I think, if people just tuned out now, they would get a lot. But tell me about the shift you experienced in, you ended up kind of falling into some consumerism traps, and you speak about it very negatively. So I'm going to speak about it negatively as well. Just kind of walk me through how you transition from using a Coke can as a hair roller, right, and saving it forever, if I remember that right, to this consumerism that kind of had you for a little while, and then we'll talk about how you extricated yourself from that. But I want to hear about the fall into it first.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that ends up happening, especially as someone who immigrated to another country, is that once you actually get some money because you haven't had it for so long and there's been so many constraints, when I actually ended up getting into the middle class because I got an engineering degree and I ended up getting a job, I was looking around at everybody else and they started buying, things that are basically represent status. Yeah. So like Coach bags were kind of my vice, right? So at that point, I started to realize, like maybe I can afford it now. Why don't I just go out and buy a whole bunch of Coach bags? And you really don't need that many of the same thing, right? But for me, it became kind of an addiction that I would spend a lot of hours watching those like YouTube videos in which there's like a teenage girl unboxing a bag. I'm like, I didn't even know this was a thing. I showed it to Bryce. He was like, why are you watching random people unboxing bags on the internet? And I'm like, but you're not looking at the hardware. Like, how do you not understand this? This is amazing. So at a certain point, it had gotten a bit out of hand when I started accumulating more and more purses. But I didn't know why I was buying them. I was just thinking like, I need to collect these because that's a status symbol. Like I'm rich now. I need to show off. It wasn't until like at one point I was gonna buy another Coach bag online that I was like drinking a can of Coke, and then like I was just like the can of Coke that I had thought was so precious as a child, now it's just like tossed aside, like unfinished, right? Yeah. So then at that point, I started to realize, how come I went from, treasuring everything and having this scarcity mindset to just buying all these bags because everyone else is doing it just to show off my status, because it's that immigrant mindset of going like, I have all this money, why don't I spend it, right? And so it really the can of Coke really brought me back to my beginnings to make me realize, you were really, really happy with this one thing that was like barely worth anything. You thought it was the best thing in the world. And now you just need to spend so much money buying so many bags that you don't need. Like, who are you, right? I couldn't even look myself in the mirror. I was like, who's this person? And then so at that point, I started thinking like, does it really make me happy? Like, this is the hedonic treadmill. This is exactly what we've been warned about. Like reading books about mindset, that once you get used to a certain lifestyle, then it no longer adds to your happiness. You're really just kind of, basically like feeding your brain. It's like your brain, like we have this chapter in the book that's like comparing it to like cocaine. You're just getting like hits to your brain over and over again. And then at that point, I was like, I'm not going to buy any more bags. I'm just going to stop. Turkey. I'm just going to stop because just cold turkey. I need to stop because this is not adding any happiness to me. And what happened to the person that thought a can of Coke was the most precious thing in the world? Now I'm just throwing a bag aside like it's nothing.
We were lucky that we got there after like, how many bags did we get to? Like 4?
Probably 5 or 6.
5 or 6? Yeah. And they were Coach bags that were like how much?
Like 200 or 300.
Oh God, that's sickening to think about. Even
I know.
But it could have been worse.
Again, like your dad said, it could have been so much worse. Because like this, I like to call this the kind of like poor person's rebound effect kind of thing. Like when they get into that, they go into this overconsumptive kind of mindset, and we know people that are still in that kind of mindset where they're still accumulating. And it can get so much worse if they're like not Coach bags, but like Louis Vuitton bags.
Yeah, I think that was just a stepping stone. Yeah. That was my stepping stone into like much worse, like where I could have gone, like I probably would have gone down the Louis Vuitton route. I might have gone like more crazy and buying more and more name brand items. I might have wanted a really big house, fancy car. Like it just goes down that
end to it.
You're talking about this like it's a drug.
Yeah, it's like gateway drug.
Like a Coach bags are like a gateway drug to like harder stuff.
Yeah, like exactly. Yeah. No, seriously, I was like sniffing those bags. Like I was like, oh man. This is so good. Seriously.
Oh my God, you were sniffing. Yeah. She would open up the bag, put her head inside, and inhale. Oh, yeah. And I only now realize, saying out loud, how drug-based drug-like that
that's
was.
Alarming.
Yeah. That's really kind of. That's alarming. That is really alarming. Now that
that's so.
Bullet dodge there. Yeah.
Bryce, where were you in the? I mean, you guys were together at this point. So tell me a little bit about just personally when you got together, married. How long you've been married, just so people have a little bit of a timeline on this.
Yeah, we got together in university, like second year or something like that, and we were lab partners, so we were kind of nerd love.
Oh, it's very romantic.
Nerd love.
It was actually not romantic. We destroyed an entire lab, but I'm not going to get into that story.
It was pretty funny. I thought it was funny, and but throughout this,
I mean, there's so many jokes there. Like you feel chemistry between each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sure you've used them all. That's good.
But my journey was much more kind of quote unquote normal. So seeing her journey from her perspective, like coming from a kind of middle class background, seeing how she reacted from going from poverty to middle class was really, really interesting, because I had never had to, and going back to something that we talked about earlier, which is the scarcity mindset. I had never really had to deal with that. And what I was seeing in her was how she dealt with money was very different from how I dealt with money.
Mm-hmm.
I never looked at price tags about, like, going into a grocery store, like a pound of grapes. Like I still can't remember how much that is. How much is a pound of grapes? How much is grapes supposed to cost?
I think probably less than $2.
Yeah. So like, I have no idea. So she was always very, very good at saving money.
Yeah.
Like she's the kind of person who would roll into a department store with a stack of coupons and then get like all this kind of, like, and then be able to buy something in some other store. It was her money. Like she was that kind of person.
Yeah. Every time we go shopping, I'm like, okay, now you owe me money. And I come back with more money than I left.
Right. So she was a competitive, I like to say she was a Olympic level competitive shopper.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about that is when it came time to learn how to, like, what to do with that money, like invest it and how to do it, she, like, the scarcity mindset was really, really debilitating for her. So for somebody who is, so like you and I know, like investing in the stock market, it can be pretty volatile. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. And for somebody who 44 cents would be your living expenses for the day, to have the stock market go down thousands of dollars in a single day, it's terrifying, right? Like you never want to have that. But the thing is, that's kind of the price of admission for investing. And so the scarcity mindset was really, really helpful in learning how to manage money, in how to budget. But it kind of runs out of gas at some point, because for somebody in the scarcity mindset, you budget because you're afraid. It is a fear-based, it's a fear-based reaction. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to investment, if you continue with a fear-based reaction, you just kind of hide inside cash and do nothing with it. So
yeah, you just cling to it.
Yeah, at a certain point, I had to trust her when it came to budgeting. But at a certain point, that ran out of gas, and she had to trust me when it came to how to invest. So
it was not easy to trust him. So I was like, this is really hard to earn money. Like maybe you can just not freak out about it when you're investing. But for me, it took a long time to actually get to that comfort level.
Yeah. Like nowadays, our portfolio is like above $1 million, and 1% of that, you and I both know that the stock market easily moves 1% in a single day, and 1% of $1 million is $10,000. You could lose $10,000 in a single day easily, right? So it's a very, very different kind of mindset that you have to get into. But what I found that was interesting, and I don't know if you you interview a lot of people, I don't know if you found this as well, but in my experience, we go around, we meet people at Chautauquas, where we met each other in Ecuador, or at conferences, or just meeting other people in the financial independence movement. And for a lot of people that made it into that kind of millionaire status, usually there was actually one person that experienced extreme poverty or fear of extreme poverty at some point. Like that fear had to be there for at least one person. And rather than being a debilitating, you and I talked about how the scarcity mindset is often depicted negatively in the media and negatively in the publishing industry. But we see it as a very different thing. We see it as a positive thing, because it keeps you from doing anything really, really risky with your money. Like it prevents you from going into debt. She is, and we continue to be, scared of debt. That's just, we avoid
totally
it.
Appropriate. Yeah.
At all costs. And for people who don't have that, they will easily just happily go into, hundreds of thousands of dollars of consumer debt or student debt. And they'll be like, this will be fine. And then it's not. It kind of requires the scarcity mindset as well as the abundance mindset. Mm-hmm. And that combination is what makes the union, like our union, so powerful. And that's kind of what allowed us to get from that bottom 1% to the top 1%.
I also think that the scarcity mindset gave me a lot of creativity. Now that seems a bit weird, because it's like if you're, that just causes you to be debilitated and you're not really thinking. But it actually, because there's constraints, and when there's constraints, you don't have as many options. Like you can't just throw money at the problem. If I was bored, I can't just be like, I'm just going to go buy some movie tickets. I'm going to just go shopping. Instead, I had to really think about, okay, what can I do that doesn't require me to have money? Maybe I can do something to better myself. Like I went to the library a lot and I read a lot of books because they're all free. And as a result, that actually ignited like a lifelong passion for writing. So if I had all the money in the world and I didn't have to worry about it and I could just go out and see a movie, there's no way I would have spent all my time in the library. So sometimes if you turn a negative into a positive and you see the scarcity mindset, for me, like what my dad taught me, which is see it as something that helps you be more creative, then you can achieve a lot of things that you never really thought you could.
Absolutely.
That's actually a really good way of turning a negative into a positive. The more kind of rich people I talk to and the more people we interview on our blog, the more I see that as a recurring theme, that they're very good at turning negatives into positive. While people who are traditionally bad with money have this nasty tendency to turn positives into negatives. Like, yes, I'm in this like great situation, but it could have been better. So I'm not going to try very hard.
Right.
Like,
or somebody else needs to come and save me.
Somebody else needs to come to save me. Mm-hmm. It's like it's somebody else's fault. It's the government's fault. It's this group's fault, or whatever. Somebody else keeping me down. It's like rich people have a really good tendency of turning bad things into positives, and then the opposite is also true.
Yeah.
People who suck with me turn positives into negatives.
In the product design world, you won't get anything creative if you don't bring constraints into the discussion quickly, right? So, the most obvious example is you go to someone, you say, "Hey, design me a product," and they're like, "What?" Already they're like, "Well, please give me a constraint. I can't get started."
Exactly.
And you're like, "Oh, I meant a washing machine." They're like, "Okay, now at least we can get going a little bit." But and then they're just like, "Well, how big does it need to be?" And does that mean that person's not creative?
Yeah.
Not at all. It's just we have to have those constraints, or we can't even settle in on what we want to do. I love the idea of the scarcity mindset. I think it's empowering. I think it shows people that they have a will inside them that they can exert on things and change external things as a result. So I think it's very empowering. I love how you kind of weave that through the book. And then you do go into that abundance mindset that Bryce mentioned around you can't stay in the scarcity spot, because you will just kind of cling, maybe fearfully. And so you give really good instruction in the book on how you invest. I really enjoyed the part where you kind of, you talk about the rich have loopholes, but then you actually in the tax code, but then you actually kind of say, well, they're not really loopholes. They're just rules that are here in the code that you can use, and it's nothing, secret. It's just that, once you have a little bit of cash and you're not just whipsawing back and forth between one thing and another, you end up having options. And one of those options is to behave in a more tax advantaged way. And so you walk people through that really well. Also, so there's a lot of great kind of step-by-step instruction, but where I really felt the book shined was just showing where you came from, how that gave you that perspective, and then what you then did with that perspective that was truly amazing. So tell me where, just kind of maybe a closing summary, what your path was from, hey, I don't want to buy any more purses and I want to do this right, to where you guys are at today, which is, how many years have you been completely free?
Yeah. So we've been retired. I don't like to use the word retired because it's not exactly, it's the fact that we don't have to go to a 9-to-5 job anymore, but we can actually choose to work on projects that we love, which is writing for the blog and writing this book. So we have been financially free for about 4 years, and we've been traveling the world ever since. So my wake up moment, going from, the addiction to purses, because I actually went at one point to almost getting addicted to houses from the purses. I came down from that, but then there was this other new shiny object that everybody else was coveting, which is, having a big fancy house and getting into a lot of debt. So that was kind of the natural path, which is what everybody follows, which is, you get a job, you're supposed to buy a house, you're supposed to work until you're 65 and climb the corporate ladder. Mm-hmm. And I had a wake up call moment for housing, where we went to an open house And there was one house that on the block, because we were renting at the time, that looked absolutely dilapidated. And I didn't think anybody would buy that house. But then somebody bought it for $500,000, like 400, almost $500,000, $400,000. Flipped it in just a matter of like a month or two, put it on the market. We went to the open house. It was not done well. The floorboards were creaking. You could tell that everything was just very half-assed. It was very, not a very
lipstick on a pig.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And guess what? They sold it they sold it in a bidding war for $800,000.
Oh my God.
So that was kind of like my thinking, okay, is this a Ponzi scheme? I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And at the same time, work was getting really stressful. Like my work started out not being too bad, but then over time it became more and more stressful. And there was the threat of layoffs as well, because there was a threat of outsourcing. And at one point I watched my coworker almost collapse and die at his desk because he was so overworked and he was in so much debt in terms of mortgage. That I started to realize, I'm like, I came all this way from living on 44 cents a day, from like coveting a can of Coke to getting to the middle class, to getting an education to get here. And then I'm still going to die at my desk.
Yeah.
What is the point of all of this? Like, what's the point of my dad's sacrifice? Like, living through a 10-year labor camp and then immigrating to another country. And if I'm still going to die at my desk, then what was it all for? And then at this point, I started to realize, okay, no, I need to find another way. I can't just do what everyone else is doing and then follow the conventional path. And, maybe my scarcity instinct kicked in again. And it was like, okay, I got to do something creative, right? This is an obstacle. I got to do something creative. I can't just like turn my brain off and just assume I'll just make money forever and work this job and I'll never get laid off and everything's going to be great. So then at that point, we discovered that there is a thing called financial independence. That if we can safely withdraw 4% from a portfolio and be able to live on that for the rest of our lives. So then I was able to take our current expenditures, which was around $40,000 at the time, and then multiply that by 25, and then figure out that we needed $1 million to retire. And the funny thing is, like now that we've been retired for 4 years, I've discovered that you may not even need that much to retire either, because one thing that I didn't know while I was working was that how inexpensive it is to actually travel. Because I really thought that travel would be very expensive based on how much I was spending on vacation while I was working. But then we discovered that you could live in Poland for like quite well for $30,000 a year. You could live in Thailand for $20,000 a year, right? So there's a lot of high quality living with very low cost, which was not something that we knew before.
And they call that is that where they use the term geo-arbitrage, essentially?
Yeah, geographic arbitrage. Yeah, so it's the idea that you're earning money in a country that has a very strong currency, like let's say US dollars, and then you move to a place with weak currency like Thailand, like Thai baht, and all of a sudden, instead of struggling to like paddle and try to get ahead in your home country, you're in another country and you're already ahead. Like one of the readers that we talked to, that we did a reader case for, which is something we do on our blog, he was struggling in Canada trying to sell cars and earning minimum wage. And then he decided, okay, you know what? I'm never going to get ahead doing this. What else can I do? And then so what he did was he moved to South Korea and then became an English teacher. And even though they paid him $30,000, so it wasn't that much higher, about the same as what he was being paid in Canada, the sales tax was only the income tax was only 3%.
Oh God! And
the job actually covered his flights and his living his accommodations. So as a result, he saved 67% of his salary, which put him 15 years towards financial independence. Whereas before he was just never, he was just so far from it. I didn't think that was even possible. Right. So it's like this idea that we have to go through this conventional path and there's no other option. It's when you actually step outside your comfort zone, and you actually look around, there's actually a lot of solutions.
Yeah.
So he ends up now doing something that he actually likes to do, which is teach and travel around Asia. And then he's actually much, much closer to financial independence. So I think after you get out of that headspace where everybody else is in, which is like, I have to follow this conventional path. We discover that even based on my scarcity mindset and like all this fear and anti-risk taking, because that's the one downside of scarcity mindset, we discover that there's so many other solutions, like geographic arbitrage being one of them, that are open to people today. Like a lot of people, millennials say like we're struck. I absolutely understand the pain that the millennials have because they're saying, student debt, we're getting into a lot of student debt. University degrees are so expensive and jobs are no longer stable. But in this generation, the internet, like we can use this to make money online, and the ability to actually travel for so much less money than we used to, and being able to earn a strong currency and spend it into a weak currency. That is a huge advantage that we can take advantage of.
Yeah, and it's only been available to the most, the highest echelons of society up until, the last decade or so, decade or
absolutely.
two.
So yeah.
That's fascinating.
So instead of like us constantly looking at what we don't have, if we look at something that we have that nobody else used to have, that our parents, our grandparents didn't have, then we'll be able to turn, like, again, you're turning a negative into a positive. Mm-hmm. You're taking something that instead of looking at what they had, boomers had all this, we didn't have this, and then turn it around. That's like another way that you can basically win at life, and you can hack the system.
One other thing on the travel that's just kind of a tiny little thought alteration is a lot of times when we think about travel, when you go to a country, you have traveled, yes, but how you behave there is completely, there's a big cost difference between acting like a tourist and living somewhere. Mm-hmm. Touring is very expensive. And it's like the classic is when you're on a cruise ship and you get off and you're like, oh, I'm a sheep here. Like you can feel it, and you just kind of are herded through things, and then you're exposed to whatever you're supposed to buy, yada yada yada, And I just remember thinking, oh, this is all just set up as tourist trap. That's a legitimate thing, And if you instead behave more like the locals that live there, you find that it's far, far less expensive.
That's a very good point.
Even when we stayed in Manhattan, where Manhattan is, crazy expensive, But even then, with 6 kids in this tiny little apartment, we figured out quickly, how to eat out really cheap, where you just have your kids share a bunch of food. You never get full at one place because we wanted to try lots of different places. Like there are all these different little hacks we used. All this free stuff that's available. You just don't get sucked into these routines that the tourists all get kind of pulled into. So even for people that are saying, I just want to travel, maybe they love their job. Maybe they're like, oh, I want to keep my job forever, but they love to travel. There are different approaches to it. One's cheap and one, you're a sucker, So I hate feeling like I'm a sucker.
Yeah,
anyway.
Yeah.
I hate it. It just gets me. Well, that's fascinating. So you guys, 4 years now, you started the blog. Did you start the blog after you were retired or kind of on your way? I can't remember now.
Yeah, we started about a year after we had already been retired. We did some volunteer work. So we did some volunteer work and traveling. We thought that we were only going to be gone for a year and we would just move back to Canada, find a cheap city to live in, and then that would be that. But so the blog actually ended up starting because I was so frustrated with so many people back home saying like, oh, renting is, you're throwing your money away with rent and you have to buy a house. And so many of my friends just constantly feel this pressure, just like, I have to buy a house because everybody tells me to do that. And then just the fear of missing out, running away. Right?
I know this is tricky for you because I just heard a podcast where you were complaining and ranting about this.
Yes. Yeah. That was recent. It's like, listen, you're buying 2 different things. Yeah. So let's all be very clear. Are you buying a car or a toaster? That's how I wish they would equate renting versus owning, because they're so wildly different. But I wish renting didn't get such a bad rap, because there's so many positives to it.
I'm seeing that as a very easy sell for real estate agents, right? Oh, renting is throwing your money away. In one word, they managed to convince you using the power of FOMO that you must go buy this thing, because if you don't, then you're missing out. Right.
But in the book, we actually break down the math. On our blog, we like to say math shit up, and that's kind of our thing. And and when we actually broke down the math of home ownership, we realized it is it's actually quite bad. If you took a house that you own for the average amount of time that an American owns a house, I think it's 5-7 years, something like that, and you assume that it goes up at the same rate as the stock market, 7% year over year, which is a really generous assumption, versus renting and then investing that amount in stocks. we actually did the math. And then when you factor in all the additional costs outside of the mortgage, the real estate commissions, the property taxes, the land transfer taxes, the lawyer fees, the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance, the utilities, all that kind of stuff, even if the capital gain on the house is something like 7% year over year, at the end of that holding period, something like 90% of it was eaten up by the additional costs that nobody actually thinks about.
Yeah.
So even if the house goes up in value, you don't get to keep any of it. All of that money gets siphoned off by governments, by the bank, by Home Depot, by the utility companies. So it is true that housing makes people money, just not the homeowner.
Right. Yeah, they're the last ones. Any scraps that are left over, if they're lucky, they fall off the table.
And that's
they might get a few of them.
And that's why there is this saying that poor people buy stuff, middle class people buy houses, rich people buy investments.
That's Robert Kiyosaki. Yeah.
That's Robert Kiyosaki. Mm-hmm. Because even with the house goes up in value, you don't get to keep any of it. Somebody is siphoning off away from you, and while at the same time convincing you, patting you on the back, saying, "Good job, you were
so responsible.
You're so responsible." They're saying that because they are stealing your money.
Yeah. And I can't remember in your calculation in the book, because you walk through very clearly. That may have been what actually inspired my rant. It may very well have been. And I know there were some people internally at YNAB that were kind of going through should we buy, should we not? So it was a kind of a perfect storm. But one thing that I can't remember in your calculation, do you factor in time that you spend going to Home Depot, time that you spend shopping online for art or whatever you're going to do to decorate your house? Is that a factor?
No, I don't think we do.
There's so much, there's additional trade-offs that you're doing that, we're already giving home ownership a lot of a big runway to compete with renting, right? And we're not even considering the amount of time that would have been put into it. One of the reasons we were able to actually get into this writing career, which is what I always wanted to do, and be able to write for the blog is because we were writing on the side while I was working. And there's no way I would have been able to do that if I had a house, because I would be constantly maintaining it. I would be constantly mowing the lawn, which is what a lot of my friends who own houses were doing. They didn't really have a lot of time to go out and hang out and do any of the work on their passions because they're constantly working on their house.
It's a bit of a part-time job.
In that calculation, so in the book, I draw a pie graph of here's all the gains that the homeowner made, and then I kind of draw a pie graph of where it all went, and then there's kind of a little tiny little sliver that's yours. I actually leave out a bunch of stuff such as decorating costs, such as furniture costs, such as stuff like that.
Yeah, you are being very generous to the ownership equation.
And the only reason why I did that is because if the cost goes over 100%, you can't make a pie graph in Excel crashes.
Okay, yeah. So you made it look even rosier than it actually is. That's good. I hope some people hearing this give it a think. And even if they just bought your book for that alone, you're talking about tens of thousands, maybe more. Actually, when you think about interest costs and things, you're talking about so much money that could be saved. And it's not to say that home ownership is, I own a home. Okay. It's paid off. It's not a big deal. Although I'll be honest, we're doing this big landscaping project, and not just the money that we've done, but the time I've spent managing that has been ridiculous. So even then you feel it, you're like, boy, wouldn't it be nice to own a condo, and just be done with this. So, anyway, I hope people give that a good hard look and don't just dismiss it out of hand. If I were a realtor, I would totally buy like a tie with a little toilet hanging from it that you would pull a little cord. It would make a flushing sound. So then you'd walk up to people and you're like, oh yeah, you don't want to flush money down your toilet, and you just pull that little cord and have this toilet flush. That'd be so powerful to reinforce oh yeah, if you rent, you're flushing your money down the toilet. And oh, did you see that realtor? He wears that toilet. He's so weird, but he'll totally sell your house for you. Or buy one for you.
Once you sign on the dotted line, you're done, right? They get the money, and if you're stuck with something that's yeah, if you're stuck with a money pit, then there's nothing you can do at that point.
Something I like to tell people, I'm just kind of like, all right, if realtors or whatever think housing is the best, if the realtors and the banks and all these like companies think that housing is the best investment ever, why are they trying to convince you to buy it? Why wouldn't they just buy all of it?
Yeah.
Right? Why wouldn't they buy all of it and rent it out to you? If it's the best investment ever that can't lose, they would buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a little bit.
They're trying to sell it to you. It's like those guys that are on, the TV trying to sell you gold because it's gold is the only thing that's going to matter once the global financial crisis, once all money doesn't matter. If gold was so valuable, wouldn't you hoard it instead of trying to sell it?
Yeah, you wouldn't want to try and sell it. You wouldn't be a seller. You'd be a buyer. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Yeah. Someone's, BSing someone here, Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So absolutely. So I think that we're trying to get people to think it's not anti-home ownership. It really is about doing the math, right?
Yeah.
Like understanding that there's so many additional costs on top of your mortgage and really question whether that actually makes sense and not just doing it just because all your friends are doing it and they're telling you that you're wasting money.
I mean, the whole book, the theme, I mean, what I'm kind of gathering from the interview and then having read the book a couple of weeks ago, it's just, you have a very unique experience. Now, not to say there weren't many in your situation. There were many in your situation, but it's unique in the sense that here in a first world country, we aren't necessarily exposed to these kinds of rags to riches stories very often. Where usually someone's been given something, it's not fair, whatever, inheritance, this is how they're rich, they got lucky, all of these kind of demotivating statements. But in your situation, you worked like crazy. I remember in your book talking about engineering, a very smart choice to make money. Smarter than writing, right? That was the calculus.
Oh yeah. I later found out how little writing makes. I was very relieved.
Yeah. So, but you sacrificed for that. And now here you are writing, which is phenomenal. But you sacrificed all along the way and you had your few moments, your few wake up calls, but here you are, and retiring and traveling is great, but you're getting to write, you're getting to do the thing you wanted to do your whole life. And that's the thing. It's not like, oh, now you can become a writer or now you can travel, because some people are like, I don't want to leave my backyard. You're like, cool, perfect.
That's totally
you probably
fine.
should own your home then.
Got to do you. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is you have this freedom and you weren't handed the freedom. You ended up coming to a country with amazing structure to allow you to thrive, right? But it was through sacrifices before you and after that made that all possible. And then that perspective you've carried through to where you're just kind of saying, listen, people, it doesn't have to be the way that everyone is doing it. Like, wake up a little, look around, do the math. I love it.
Okay, everybody, that was a wrap. Thanks for listening to the interview with Kristy and Bryce, authors of Quit Like a Millionaire. I highly recommend that you pick it up. If anything was interesting from the interview, I guarantee that you'll be able to dive in quite a bit deeper with the book. As I said before at the beginning, I thoroughly enjoyed this. It was very motivating and helped me feel quite a bit of desire to cut out the non-essentials and really find out what I cared about most and make sure that my money served that purpose. Until next time, follow YNAB's 4 rules and you will win financially. You've never budgeted like this.